The common area we see many triathletes make maybe an error with their strength training is how they structure it. So because you've seen in typically internet articles and magazines, training split into what we call body part splits. So by that what I mean is one day you might do your chest, your back and your arms, and then another day you might do your core and your hips. So essentially you're creating the structure of your strength training around training certain specific areas of your body. It's actually an approach which ironically came from bodybuilding, and it's what bodybuilders use to maximise muscle mass and their aesthetics. But obviously as triathletes, that is not what we're doing strength training for. So what is it that you can do to make sure you avoid that and instead use an approach which is going to be much more effective to making sure the time you spend in here is going to be more effective in improving you for your swim, bike and run. Now the reason for this is when you go cycling, for example, you use strength to create power moving at your hip and your knee. So that will use a whole load of muscles, gluteals, hamstrings, quadriceps, and those will work together to produce an effective high performing pedaling of motion. What doesn't happen is your hamstrings or your glutes or your quads don't work in isolation. So if you train them in isolation, even though the muscle will get stronger, the transfer of that from in the gym out onto the road won't be as much because essentially those muscles work together. It's a bit like if you had a new band, you had a guitarist, a drummer and a keyboard player. They could all practice individually on their own and get better. But if they also included practicing where they were playing together, the actual outcome of one of their concerts would be much better because they're used to doing both things. So again, critical thing, you want your training to be structured around movements that underpin triathlon performance, not necessarily muscles. But as we said, there is a disclaimer, training certain weak links within the chain, certain muscles that we can have problems in. We said glutes, hamstrings, perfect example of where we maybe do want to do some isolation work. Now, a second challenge with doing body part splits is to do with this, and it's time. So if I'm thinking I've got 8 different body parts to have to train, all of a sudden, instantly as a time-strapped triathlete, which we all are, I'm thinking, I'm not going to have enough time for that, so I'm not going to do it. Or I'm going to think, I've got so much stuff to get through, I'm going to have to be quick. So you end up doing one exercise into another exercise, into another exercise. There's no rest. It becomes circuit training. Essentially, as we spoke about extensively, it doesn't become strength training because the intensity is so low because you're trying to rush through so many exercises because you think you've got to do them all. But instead, if you take the approach like we spoke about, thinking of movements, what you can do is say, well, I'm going to focus on my extension at my hip and my knees, which is huge for cycling and also running. I'm also going to have a focus on, let's say, movement at my shoulder joint and my shoulder blade as one. Critical for swimming. All of a sudden, instead of having 8 different body part splits to do, I've just got 2 things to focus on. But the quality of those things is very high because they're very specific to what you need as a triathlete. And also, as we spoke about, making sure the strength work will be based on movements. So if you're a time-strapped triathlete, which we all are, you can see the difference between when you're doing body part splits, generally trying to hit lots of things and having to rush through it. Whereas when you've got the focused approach that we spoke about, all of a sudden what it means is you can narrow down the exercises that you need to do to a handful of really quality ones. You can use appropriate rest on those, so we get some really good intensity out of what you do. Consequently, the training that you do in that case will have a far more bigger impact on your swim, bike and run outside compared to doing these body part splits like bodybuilders would do, where you're just trying to cram through and just really do work for the sake of work. And last but not least, where we would maybe use certain body part exercises, where we might train a weak link within the body, could be with somebody who's had an injury and we need to really make sure we strengthen that specific area of the body. So maybe they had a calf strain and we really need to make sure we overload strength through that muscle itself to protect it. But also again, we know in triathlon, specific muscles do have to transfer a lot of force and typically can become vulnerable to injury. So again, we might use certain exercises as well, maybe one within a program just to isolate that out. So even though there will be these bigger, what we call compound movements, where we're working multiple joints and multiple muscles at once, creating these key movements for triathlon, there still is always a tendency in a good program, like what we do, to make sure that maybe there is a little bit of attention to certain weak links. And the other area with that is we typically, with the triathletes we coach across the world, is the starting point for them will tend to involve some more exercises that are maybe in isolation a little bit. So we're not doing body part splits, but for example, to get somebody to build up to be able to squat effectively, we might begin doing more glute focused work on a hip lift where there's a bit of movement at the knees, but again, it's quite a hip dominant movement. So again, as you get more skilled and more developed at strength and conditioning, you'll tend to find your ability and your skill to be able to do these bigger movements where we've got multiple joints moving, we've got multiple muscles working together. You can start to add that in. So as a beginner, somebody new to strength and conditioning, again, using more isolation exercises can have its place, but again, that isn't creating training over a week, which is body part splits. As a bodybuilder would do, that's a very different type of training. So now you can start to strength train more like a triathlete and less like a bodybuilder. Any questions you've got, put them in the comments below. If you want to learn more about how we online support triathletes across the world with the best strength and conditioning available, you can go to TriTenacious.com, the link's in the description. And as always, if you can like and subscribe to our channel, it will allow us to create even better videos like this to help people across the world with their triathlon goals and ambitions.